Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Better Call Saul Season 3, Episode 4, Sabrosito. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Better Call Saul, so I have to start with a spoiler warning for Better Call Saul. If you haven't seen up to Season 3, Episode 4, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So, wow, this was a really great episode that had me engaged throughout and really excited to see what comes next. In fact, if I had one complaint about this episode is that it ended too soon and left me wanting more. In fact, it kind of felt like half an episode and not a full story in itself. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because Better Call Saul takes its time to tell a great story well, and in cases like this episode, it does so well and works out all in the end. In previous seasons, I talked about how Better Call Saul often seems like it was created to be binged because it really tells one story over an entire season, and the episodes aren't really created to stand alone and are more of just little pieces that contribute to the great, awesome whole. So the show is actually more enjoyable watching on the binge, but of course I don't have the patience to wait until the season's over to watch it all at once, and I want it now. And of course, it's also great to stop for a breather and analyze the richness and complexity in each episode before moving on to the next. So it would actually really work either way. But this episode in particular literally had me yelling at the screen when the end credits came, going, "No! Don't end now!" Next week is going to seem like a very, very long way off. So, getting into the content of this episode, let's start with Gus, because we got a lot of Gus in this episode, and I absolutely positively loved it. In fact, I kind of wondered if the entire episode would just be Gus, Mike, and Hector's story, and not show Jimmy, Kim, or Chuck at all, and I would have been perfectly fine with that. But it turns out that we did get some Jimmy and Chuck towards the end of the episode, and I was fine with that too. So we start with the scene of Don Ilario, whom we've seen from Breaking Bad as a cartel boss or drug lord, or however you want to call him, and Hector brings him his share of money from the drug trade, only to be outdone by an emissary from Gus, who brings him a lot more money that's more neatly packaged. And in short, Hector is humiliated by Gus in front of the boss, something Hector doesn't take lightly. So he later goes to one of Gus's Los Pollos Hermanos stores and humiliates and intimidates Gus and demands that Gus help him distribute his drugs. This, of course, is because Hector's supply line has been compromised, specifically by Gus, who utilized Mike. Now, whether or not Hector knows Gus was responsible for his trucks and his place of business being seized by the government is not made clear, but if I had to guess, I would say he suspects Gus is responsible, which is part of the reason why Hector went to strong-arm Gus. So this is part of Better Call Saul that I feel those who haven't seen Breaking Bad are kind of missing out on. Sure, they would probably still be able to keep up with the story and get the gist of what's going on here between Gus and Hector, but they only get a tiny fraction of the picture, as so much more about what's going on is explained already in Breaking Bad. Not just what happened in the future, but what also happened in the past. As in Breaking Bad, we got the explanation of the history between Gus, Hector, and Don Ilario. That Gus first came to Don Ilario with a pitch to sell meth and was there with his protege, whom he was really close to, who in fact is the other hermano in Los Pollos Hermanos. And Don Ilario had him killed, and it was Hector who killed him. So this explains why Gus has it out for Hector. He also has it out for Don Ilario, but he takes care of him in Breaking Bad, so we won't see that storyline followed up on here. However, it does seem like he took care of Hector before Breaking Bad started, so we will get to see that storyline played out here. In fact, we got a lot of nice callbacks to that storyline in this episode, with the scene by the pool and that scene that we got of lot of shots emphasizing the pool, like shots that sort of seem to come up from underneath the water. And those who have seen Breaking Bad know the significance of that, as Gus will eventually poison Don Ilario, who dies and falls into that pool. But in Breaking Bad, we see a conflict between the cartel and Gus break out as he starts to grow more independent of them and stops contributing to the cartel, as we see him do here. So that's not until years later. At this point in the timeline, Gus is still playing nice with the cartel, and in this case, he's outdoing Hector. So by Breaking Bad times, Hector is paralyzed and in the wheelchair and can only communicate through ringing a bell, and is lonely, only taken care of by his nephew Tuco. But after Tuco dies, he's vanquished to a nursing home, one in which Gus will often visit him there to gloat about his downfall. So it seems from this season we're getting more background into just how much Gus is responsible for his downfall, because it does seem to be going in the direction that Gus will be directly responsible for the condition that he is in Breaking Bad. Of course, we also know how Gus dies, that Walter White uses Hector to kill him in a suicide bomb, so we know in the end Hector gets the last laugh, and Gus actually made a huge mistake by not simply killing Hector here, and wanting him to suffer much longer actually comes back to bite him in the ass, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Anyway, one thing I was wondering about before was, if Hector is this big crime boss, how come once he gets paralyzed he ends up alone in a nursing home and is not more taken care of or set up for life? But this episode helps make that a bit more clear, as it seems Gus isn't just going to paralyze him, but ultimately discredit him and take away any pull that he may have with the cartel by outdoing him and embarrassing him. So that when Hector does get paralyzed, he won't have any friends and will be dependent on relatives to take care of him, and once they're dead, he'll end up alone in a nursing home. But getting back to the episode, it was self-contained in some ways, as those who haven't seen Breaking Bad have no idea who Gus Fring was, do get a sense of the kind of man he is in this episode, as he is a pillar of the community and that he has an adversarial relationship with Hector. In fact, in Breaking Bad, when Hank suggested that Gus may be a drug dealer, someone retorted, why not claim Colonel Sanders for, responsible for dealing drugs? So the idea that he's involved in anything illegal is utterly absurd. So to have Hector and his goons show up in his restaurant and rough up his employees and customers is in fact a huge deal, as it could potentially tarnish Gus's crystal clean reputation. But as we see in this episode, Gus manages to contain the situation. However, I will say that it did strike me as a bit unrealistic that the assistant manager of the restaurant didn't simply call the police on Hector when he started smoking and going behind the employee section. That would seem to be the right thing to do in that situation. Well, you may say he was intimidated by Hector's goons. Well, then the question is, why did not any of those customers who left call the police and let them know a restaurant was under siege by goons? So that part of it I felt was a bit fake and more of done for plot convenience, and didn't really strike me as realistic, but that's just a minor complaint, so whatever. It was worth it though in the end, as we get a scene with Hector literally acting like he owns the place and bossing Gus around as he sits in his chair and scrapes dog shit off of his shoe with Gus's pen onto Gus's desk, and basically tells Gus outright that he must do what he says. And again, this scene is informed by the flashback we saw in Breaking Bad where Hector kills Gus's protege, because Hector still looks on Gus as a nothing ant that can be pushed around. So one thing that's clear to me is after this scene that Gus simply won't let this stand. In fact, in the following scene where he's talking to his employees and telling them the story of the guys bullying him for money, he tells them that he considered at first giving the money to them, but then realized that no, this is the USA and they have no power here, so he's going to stand up to them. Now, even though the story he tells is bullshit, there are elements of truth to it, and so I think he's describing his actual reaction to Hector, and that he is brewing a plan to get revenge on Hector, and more importantly, put him in his place. What this plan is, I'm not sure, but I am sure of two things. One, he will be successful in putting Hector in his place, and two, it will end with Hector being paralyzed, but I'm absolutely fascinated to see how this plays out. So then we see Gus go to Mike after Mike refuses to take payment for sabotaging Hector's trucks, and I was expecting Gus to, sort of constrict Mike into his next plan to take Hector down, but that's not exactly what happened. Gus instead tells Mike where he, why he really stopped him from killing Hector, saying a bullet to the head would have been too humane. And he also asked Mike if he'd be interested in working for him, and he said that it depends on the work. So again, we know that by Breaking Bad times, Mike becomes Gus's right-hand man, so this does appear to be the origins of that, but we still have a ways to go to get to that point. So I also very strongly believe that Mike will be instrumental in Gus's plans in taking Hector down. In fact, I do believe Gus's sentiments on wanting Hector to suffer will entice Mike even more. So yes, I'm absolutely dying to see where this goes next. So now let's get into the Jimmy storyline, which we didn't get a whole lot in this episode, but we got some. So it starts with Kim going down the phone book and calling every place in the city that repairs doors to try to find the one that Chuck called to repair his door. And once she finds it, she cancels the appointment and tells Jimmy about it, who is pleased and says he has the right guy for the job. So the next thing we see is Mike shows up at Chuck's store posing as the repairman, and I literally cheered when we saw Mike standing there. I don't know why I wasn't expecting this, because of course, but it was awesome. So it's obvious Jimmy coached Mike on how best to get rid of Chuck by using electricity, and so Mike proceeds to take tons of pictures of Chuck's place. And Jimmy is very pleased with the results, but what exactly he's going to do with this is still a mystery to me. But I did love the relationship established with Mike and Jimmy, where I get the impression they don't, pay each other for these jobs, but have more of a tit-for-tat relationship where Jimmy does something for Mike and then Mike does something for Jimmy to pay him back. Mike still had a sort of attitude with Jimmy in this scene, so obviously they aren't friends, but more of have a mutual beneficial relationship, and this is consistent with how the relationship is in Breaking Bad. And I do believe Jimmy will have an effect on how Mike ultimately becomes a PI, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So then we get the scene where Jimmy actually signs the PPD, which threw me off because I was under the impression that Jimmy wouldn't be signing the PPD because he said in the previous episode that we're going to, quote, shove the PPD up Chuck's ass. But apparently that's not what he meant, as it was apparent after this scene that if it is their plan for Jimmy to sign the PPD, but because that is ultimately the best option for getting him off with no jail time, but they intend to fight Chuck at the disciplinary hearing, and they have a plan to keep Jimmy from getting disbarred, which we know that he won't, but again, I have no idea how this will happen. So it's interesting, in the meeting, Jimmy pretty much had to play like he was defeated, and what was really interesting was when the prosecutor insisted that Jimmy apologize to Chuck. Now, we knew from the earlier scene that Jimmy recognized that it was important for him to show remorse, so I do think he was working on this a bit and planning for it, and so was able to make a very long, convincing speech about how what he did was wrong and how very sorry he was. And you can tell just how hard it was for Jimmy to do this, as he absolutely hates Chuck and isn't at all sorry in the slightest bit, but he recognizes the importance of appearing remorseful, so it shows that he's being smart about this. And considering all that, I'd say Jimmy did a good job of apologizing. And one thing about this scene I really like is when they come up with the sum total that Jimmy owes Chuck, and Chuck argues that it isn't right and adds in something like $1.98 for the cost of the tape, and the look that both Jimmy and Kim give him when he said that was absolutely golden. It was just like, are you fucking serious? You're being pedantic about $2? It was just fucking golden. So the scene ends with Kim confronting Chuck and Howard about the disciplinary hearing, where she asks about the tape, and Chuck finally reveals that he does still have a copy of the tape, which he insists will be played at the hearing no matter what. So then Kim looks defeated and goes to Jimmy, and they both walk and talk, where Jimmy simply asks, well, and they both look kind of sullen until Kim smiles and says, bingo, to which Jimmy looks very pleased, and then they both walk off like badasses. So it's obvious that Chuck still having the tape plays right into their hands. How? I don't know. What this has to do with the pictures that Mike took, I have no idea. So I am dying, absolutely dying to know what their big play is. I can't wait to see this play out, which is why it was so agonizing that this episode ended where it did. But this means we will get a full episode where Jimmy and Kim's plan comes to fruition, and I absolutely positively cannot wait to see that. So my rating for Sabrosito out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. An amazing episode that had me engaged throughout, that gave us a lot of fascinating backstory to Gus Fring, as well as laying the groundwork for a very interesting fight to keep Jimmy's law license, and it lays out the bricks to build this great story in all the right ways that has me unbelievably excited to see the rest of the season. So that's it for my review of Sabrosito. Be sure to check back here every week as I continue to review episodes of Better Call Saul, as well as doing many more videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, The Leftovers, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.